This is fascinating. I mean, as Mackenzie had mentioned, this comes on the heels of the NVIDIA OpenAI deal. And if you want to think about the circularity of yesterday's deal, then you loop in Oracle and OpenAI and Oracle teaming up, and it's sort of this big...
Takes you back to that announcement back at the White House. And that was, we saw those three stocks, or those that could trade, excuse me, were out there moving. And yes, there are linkages, and there's overlap in terms of the ownership. And some of this, a lot of this goes back to Larry Ellison. And look, Oracle has done an amazing job transforming their business. And the question we ask constantly is it profitable business? And ultimately, but when you look at where they're going to be spending on data center relative to themselves, this CapEx is bigger than any of the hyperscalers who have announced so far. So no question, the right partners, no question, there is demand. The question is really, what's it worth?
OpenAI is spending a lot of, there's a lot of money being circulated. Yes. One has to wonder where it's going to come from. But shelve that for a second. Let's talk about Oracle, because they're being rewarded for this revenue, and maybe justifiably so, but we still don't know what the earnings are going to be. And if you just do back of the envelope on what expected earnings are, I mean, you got Oracle trading close to 40 times next year's numbers, which is historic for Oracle. And, it's somewhat historic for the space in general, if you think about what's going on here. Now, they might earn their way into that, but that's a big leap to make from where it historically trades to where it's trading now.
God, we sound a little pessimistic here, because I'm just going to kind of jump on the thing here.
Wait a minute. Now
all
right,
so you asked the question.
Guy?
So it's the energy that you just asked about. It's the financing. Okay, so fine. These hyperscalers, they got a lot of cash. They generate a lot of cash. They can keep doing 25, 30% of the revenue until things just kind of stall out a little bit. But where does a company like Oracle that has $100 billion in debt and not a whole heck of a lot of cash, and really is going to have negative free cash flow for the beginning here to try to build this out? And so you think about this, Oracle is actually going to need NVIDIA to come in and take a stake so they can buy their chips, right? So when you think about the CapEx here for all of these build-outs, about 50, 60% of it is NVIDIA GPUs, right? And so there's obviously crazy demand for them. We haven't even talked about XAI, right? And the demand and some of the things that they're talking about that they're building out. So who's going to finance all this? And so once you get away from the major hyperscalers, then you got to tap debt markets, and you got to tap, a whole sort of not just public debt, but private credit, that sort of thing. So at some point, this is going to become massively embedded into our economy if it hasn't already. I think there's some estimates that it's 50% of our GDP over the last year or so. So it will not take much of a hiccup to actually have reverberations throughout the economy, not just the tech economy. And this is one of the similarities. I think you can bring it back to 25 years ago. People thought it was very isolated to the internet and the spend and the fiber that was being laid. But the moment there was not the sort of demand that the build, right, was expecting, then you had a massive slowdown across the economy. Take that forward into 07, into 08, and I don't mean to draw too many lines together here, but the financialization of a whole host of things, the housing market, that led to this. So when you think about the interconnectivity, you think about the scale globally, but also all of these companies that are, listen, Oracle, they are attached at the hip with OpenAI. Microsoft to some degree is. So there's just a lot of interconnectivity here that I don't think the markets are pricing whatsoever.
Ahead of them in line, right? I mean, in other words, Microsoft personally has the first call on some of that capacity. And ultimately, this gets back to who is benefiting now, and where's there really not only a revenue accretion, but where there's actually profitability that changes in the face of AI. A lot of this is CapEx with the built and the promise on tomorrow. And it gets back to that trade, right? And we've clearly seen the rotation on the build and the promise for tomorrow over the last 3 weeks. This has not been about the early players. The first round of this was clearly Meta, then Microsoft, and to some extent some of the other hyperscalers.
Right. I mean, but to speak to the rotation that we've seen here, I mean, look at Microsoft. Microsoft since July, it's only up mid-single digits here. I mean, like, Julie, where do you stand on some of the valuations being afforded to the likes of an Oracle, let's say? The desk here brings up good points in terms of growing into the revenue estimates and growing into that valuation.
I think what's really, I agree with Dan. I think the difference with Oracle is now we're talking about debt. And you know that when you're in any kind of a CapEx cycle, once you've moved away and you're into debt, that starts to really change the economics, and that starts to also really ramp the risk. And so clearly, when you see an NVIDIA choosing to take this partnership link with OpenAI in order to juice up the demand, that tells you that they recognize that they're going to have to stimulate their own demand. And that's not necessarily a great sign in terms of the sustainability of the growth. And I think that that really reflects this interconnected nature of all of these companies. But what it really, really points to is that we have no clarity on what is the revenue potential of all of this investment. It is still completely an opaque concept that we have no real understanding of. Yes, enterprises are moving some of their workloads. They're experimenting with AI to see how it can improve their productivity, but they're not really seeing a lot of the fruits of that labor or investment. And at what point do they start to look back and say, you know what, never mind, we'll just wait for this technology to mature?